The unseen shadows. It was a typical Friday evening in the city. Car engines, distant honks, and street chatter filled the air as Judge Elena Chambers wound her way through the city in her sit-in. She was a pillar in the legal community, known for her unwavering sense of justice and her commitment to upholding the law without bias. Her reputation for integrity had earned her respect and admiration, though it sometimes came at a personal cost. Today, Elena's mind was occupied with thoughts of her son, Jason, who was returning home for the weekend. She hadn't seen him in months, and the thought of sharing stories and laughter filled her with warmth. Her journey home was peaceful, weaving through suburban streets as the city lights flickered behind her. But as she passed a familiar intersection, the flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror jolted her from her thoughts. Elena's heart sank, replaced by a feeling she knew too well. She went over her mental checklist: seatbelt fastened, speed limit observed, full stop at the intersection. She hadn't done anything wrong, yet the sight of those lights brought a sense of unease she couldn't shake. Elena took a deep breath and pulled over, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. She watched through the mirror as the officer approached. A young man, his gaze cold and calculating. He placed his hand casually on his holstered gun as he arrived at her window. "License and registration," he demanded, his tone detached and impersonal. Elena complied without hesitation, passing her documents over. She had been here before, too many times to count, and each time the experience left her feeling worn. She had nothing to hide, yet here she was, facing suspicion simply because of who she was and the car she drove. As the officer examined her license, his demeanor shifted, eyes narrowing at the sight of her title. "Judge Chambers," he muttered, a slight smirk forming. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" "I'm not sure," she replied evenly, holding his gaze. "Can you tell me?" "You failed to make a complete stop back there, and you were speeding," he said with a sneer. Elena frowned. She knew she had done neither, yet she remained silent, aware that arguing would only fuel his power play. She had witnessed similar cases in her courtroom, and she knew how quickly situations like these could spiral. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered abruptly. "Is that necessary, officer?" Elena's voice was calm, but tinged with tension. "Step out now," he repeated, his tone unyielding. Reluctantly, Elena complied. Standing by the side of the road, she watched as he began to search her car, lifting her belongings, rummaging through her glove compartment, as if expecting to find something incriminating. The knot of anger and frustration tightened in her stomach. She was no stranger to the injustices that plagued society, and this was a bitter reminder that even her position didn't shield her from them. After several long, humiliating minutes, the officer closed her door and returned her license without a word. He didn't apologize, nor did he offer any explanation. Instead, he simply said, "You're free to go." Elena remained silent, the burn of indignation simmering beneath her calm exterior. She got back into her car, hands trembling slightly as she gripped the wheel. The encounter was over, but its impact lingered, a reminder of the bias woven into the fabric of the society she had spent her career fighting to reform. As she drove away, Elena's mind was no longer on her reunion with Jason. Instead, it was filled with questions about how many others faced this treatment, people without her title or her influence, people who didn't have the power to speak out or demand justice. This wasn't just about her. It was about a system that seemed unbreakable, a system that permitted those in power to abuse it without consequence. When she arrived home, Elena was greeted by Jason's warm embrace and his cheerful stories of life at college. But beneath her smile, the weight of the evening's encounter remained. As they sat down to dinner, Jason noticed her faraway expression. "Mom, is everything okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Elena hesitated for a moment, considering whether to share the incident. She didn't want to dampen the joyful reunion with her son, but she knew that if she didn't speak up, she would be betraying her own beliefs. "I had a run-in with an officer on my way home," she finally said, her voice quiet but steady. He pulled me over for no reason and treated me like a suspect. It was dehumanizing. Jason's expression turned dark with anger. You? A judge? That's messed up, Mom. You should report him. Elena nodded, her resolve strengthening. I will. Not just for myself, but for everyone who faces this kind of treatment without anyone to defend them. It's time I use my position to make a difference. As they continued their dinner, Elena's mind was already racing with plans. This wasn't over, and she was determined to ensure that what had happened to her wouldn't happen again. Not to her, not to anyone. Lighting the fire. The next morning, Elena woke early, the events of the previous night lingering like a shadow. She had tried to shake off the encounter, but the memory clung to her, unsettling and inescapable. The indignity of it felt like an affront not only to herself, but to the countless people who were silenced by fear or powerlessness. She had been treated with suspicion despite her role as a judge, a position she had fought to attain precisely because she wanted to bring fairness and justice to her community. Elena made herself a cup of coffee, her mind already plotting her next move. She was no stranger to injustice. Her career had been dedicated to dismantling it piece by piece from within the system. But now, standing in her own kitchen with the early morning light filtering through the window, she realized that dismantling wasn't enough. It was time to expose it. Her son, Jason, stumbled into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes. His carefree expression from last night was gone, replaced by a look of steely determination. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat across from her, silently supportive. They had always been close, and Jason understood that when his mother set her mind to something, there was no stopping her. I've been thinking about last night, Elena began, her voice calm but resolute. This can't end with just me feeling frustrated and humiliated. That officer treated me like a suspect for no reason. He searched my car, trying to find something, anything, to justify his actions. And if this can happen to me, it happens to others who don't have the means to fight back. Jason nodded, his face set with anger. What are you going to do about it? I'm going to file a formal complaint. But that's not enough. I want to make this a public issue, Elena replied. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her decision. I'm tired of watching people be mistreated by the very system that's supposed to protect them. It's time people know what's happening. Jason's gaze softened with admiration. I'm with you, Mom. Whatever you need. They spent the next few hours in her study, gathering information and documenting every detail of the encounter. Elena made notes about the officer's demeanor, his unwarranted demand for her to step out of the car, his thorough yet baseless search. She knew the system well, knew the arguments the police department would likely use to defend his actions. It was all too familiar, a script she had seen play out in her courtroom time and time again. This time, however, she would be the one writing the ending. Later that day, Elena called Marcus Williams, a renowned civil rights attorney with whom she had collaborated on cases involving police misconduct. They had both fought tirelessly for justice, but this case was different. This time, it was personal. Marcus answered on the first ring. Judge Chambers, he greeted her warmly. It's always a pleasure, but this sounds serious. It is, Elena replied, filling him in on the details of her traffic stop. I need your help, Marcus. I want to file a formal complaint against the officer, but I also want this to go public. People need to see what's happening in their communities. There was a brief silence on the other end before Marcus responded. I'm with you, Elena. This is the kind of case that could shake things up. But it won't be easy. The police department will close ranks to protect one of their own. It's going to get messy. Elena's voice was firm. I've been dealing with messy for my entire career. I know the risks, but I can't stay silent. Too many people don't have the privilege to fight back. I need to do this. Then let's get to work, Marcus agreed. We'll start with a formal complaint and prepare for the media coverage. This isn't just about one officer. It's about the culture that enables this behavior. They spent the next hour going over strategies, drafting a complaint that left no room for interpretation. Every detail was meticulously documented, each action scrutinized for its legality. They crafted a compelling narrative, one that would resonate with those who had faced similar injustices and ignite a conversation about police accountability. When they finished, Marcus spoke again, his voice solemn. "Elena, once this goes public, there will be backlash. The media can be relentless. They'll dig into your past, look for anything they can twist. Are you ready for that?" Elena nodded, a steely resolve in her gaze. "This isn't about me, Marcus. It's about doing what's right. I'm prepared for whatever comes." As the day wore on, Elena felt a surge of energy she hadn't felt in years. She was stepping out of her role as a judge, not to break the law, but to hold it accountable. The system that she had upheld for so long was flawed, and it was time to confront those flaws openly. That evening, as she sat down to dinner with Jason, the gravity of her decision settled over her. She knew there would be consequences, both personal and professional, but she was ready to face them, knowing that she was standing up not just for herself, but for the countless others who had been silenced. "Mom," Jason said, breaking the silence, "you're doing something incredible. I'm proud of you." Elena smiled, feeling the warmth of his support. "Thank you, Jason. This is just the beginning. There's a long road ahead, but we're on it together." The following day, Elena and Marcus filed the formal complaint. The media was quick to pick up the story, and within hours, headlines began to circulate. "Respected judge files complaint against officer for racial profiling." Elena braced herself for the whirlwind that would follow, knowing that she was walking into a storm. But she was ready. This was her fight now, and she would see it through to the end. In the days that followed, her phone rang constantly. Friends, colleagues, and strangers reached out, some offering support, others cautioning her against challenging the police. But Elena was undeterred. She had lit a fire, and she wasn't going to let it die out. When the police department responded, their statement was brief and defensive. They claimed the officers' actions were within protocol and that there was no evidence of misconduct. Elena read their words with a sense of grim satisfaction. She knew they would deny everything. But she also knew that public scrutiny was a powerful force, and once people saw the evidence, they would question the system just as she had. The case was scheduled for an internal review, and Elena prepared herself for the fight of her life. She had spent years defending justice in the courtroom, but now she was fighting for something greater. This was her chance to challenge the biases that lurked in the shadows, the unseen forces that shaped so many lives. She was no longer just a judge. She was a woman demanding justice in a world that too often looked the other way. As Elena stood in her living room that night, looking out at the city lights, she felt a sense of purpose and clarity. The journey ahead would be difficult, but she was ready for whatever it would bring. The fire had been lit, and she would not allow it to be extinguished. Not until justice was served. The rising storm. Elena knew that moving forward with the complaint would draw attention and scrutiny, but the reaction exceeded her expectations. Within days, her story spread across local and national media, igniting passionate discussions on social media, talk shows, and in the halls of power. Her case had touched a nerve. In a world where many people had become numb to stories of injustice, the public saw in Elena's actions a chance to confront a larger truth, a truth many had tried to ignore or downplay. By midweek, her inbox was flooded with messages from people who had experienced similar treatment. Mothers wrote to her about their teenage sons stopped repeatedly for looking suspicious. A young woman shared how she was pulled over for a broken taillight that wasn't actually broken. An older man recounted the humiliation he felt being searched in front of his grandchildren without cause. These voices, raw and deeply personal, added weight to Elena's already heavy heart, reinforcing her resolve to press forward. But not all the responses were supportive. Some of the messages were critical, even threatening. Online commenters, many hiding behind anonymous profiles, accused her of playing the race card, of overreacting, or disgracing the badge. More than once, she read messages suggesting she should resign or be taught a lesson about respecting the law. The backlash stung, but she had expected this reaction. Every groundbreaking case she had ever tried faced resistance. She knew that pushing against deeply ingrained biases would trigger defensive, often hostile reactions. However, she was prepared to weather the storm, knowing that every step she took was a step toward justice. Late Thursday night, as she sat in her quiet study surrounded by stacks of legal briefs, case files, and the initial notes for her complaint, her phone rang. It was Marcus. "Elena, you've started something here," Marcus said, his voice both impressed and wary. "I knew this case would spark conversation, but it's igniting a whole movement. The media is calling me for interviews. They want your story. They want to know what inspired you to file this complaint." Elena leaned back, rubbing her temples. "It's bigger than I expected too, Marcus. But this isn't just about me. It's about everyone who doesn't have the resources or the influence to fight back. I won't let the fear of backlash stop us." "You're braver than most, Elena," he replied. "But the police department has already started its defense. I heard from a friend that they're gathering evidence to frame this as a misunderstanding. They'll try to paint you as overreacting." Elena chuckled, a hollow sound. "Let them try. We have dash cam footage, witness statements, and the truth. They can't hide behind misunderstandings anymore." As they ended the call, Elena felt a renewed surge of determination. She had anticipated resistance, but she hadn't fully considered how powerful the opposition would be. The following day, a notice from the police department's public relations office appeared in her inbox, warning that they would be conducting an investigation and would present the facts to clear up any misperceptions about the encounter. In the days leading up to the hearing with Internal Affairs, the city felt electrified. News stations replayed snippets of the dashcam footage, pausing to zoom in on Elena's calm, respectful demeanor versus the officer's aggressive body language. Analysts debated what constituted reasonable cause for a stop and search, while activists and civil rights groups organized rallies and marches in support of her. As her story gathered momentum, an unexpected ally appeared. Councilwoman Teresa Rhodes, a fiery advocate for reform, reached out to Elena. Known for her no-nonsense approach to addressing systemic issues, Teresa had been working for years to pass policies mandating police accountability and transparency. Her previous attempts had been met with roadblocks, resistance from police unions, and bureaucratic delays. But now, with Elena's case front and center, Teresa saw an opportunity to reignite the push for real change. "Elena, I've been following your story closely," Teresa said as they met in a small coffee shop on the edge of downtown. "I want to help. We've needed someone like you, someone with a voice that people respect, to shed light on these issues. I believe together we can do something meaningful." Elena felt a spark of hope. She had admired Teresa's tenacity for years, watching her champion causes that others were afraid to touch. "I appreciate that, Teresa. I've been fighting for justice my whole career, but this is different. It feels like an uphill battle." "We can push harder with this momentum," Teresa replied, her eyes fierce with determination. "This is more than just a complaint. This is a call to action for everyone who has ever faced unfair treatment or profiling." They discussed strategies for garnering broader support. Teresa suggested a public town hall, inviting both community members and police department representatives to openly discuss the policies and attitudes that had enabled these encounters to continue unchecked. "We need transparency," Teresa said. "Let people see the truth, hear the stories. Once the public truly understands, there's no turning back." Elena agreed, feeling the power of community support for the first time. She had always been a private person, but she realized that standing alone would no longer be enough. She was no longer just representing herself. She was a symbol of hope for many. The town hall was scheduled for the following weekend. Teresa's team worked tirelessly, reaching out to community leaders, activists, and media outlets to ensure that the event would draw attention. Elena's name, her case, and her story were in the headlines every day leading up to the event. The anticipation grew with everyone. Supporters, detractors, activists, and officials, waiting to see what would unfold. On the night of the town hall, the room was packed. Rows upon rows of people filled the community center, spilling out into the hallway and beyond. Television cameras captured the scene, streaming it live to thousands of viewers. A nervous energy filled the air as Elena took her seat at the front alongside Teresa, local clergy members, and representatives from civil rights groups. The councilwoman opened the event with a powerful speech about community, justice, and the need for transparency. She spoke passionately about the responsibility of those in power to protect all citizens, not just some. The crowd responded with applause and cheers, and Elena felt a swell of pride as she realized that people were truly listening. When it was her turn to speak, Elena stood, her heart pounding as she faced the sea of faces. She took a deep breath, finding strength in the supportive eyes of strangers, friends, and allies. "I am not here to accuse every police officer of misconduct," she began, her voice steady and clear. "I'm here because of a broken system, a system that allows incidents like mine to happen regularly without accountability. I filed my complaint not just for myself, but for everyone who has ever been treated unfairly by those sworn to protect them. I believe that we can do better. I believe that we can demand better." The room was silent, hanging on her every word. Elena continued, sharing the stories of the emails and letters she had received from people around the country. She spoke of mothers worried for their children, of young men afraid to walk their own streets, of elderly women afraid to report crimes out of fear they themselves would be questioned or ignored. Each story she shared seemed to breathe life into the room, creating a connection between her and the people who had come to listen. After Elena spoke, the floor opened up for questions and comments. Several community members stood to voice their experiences, adding their voices to the collective call for change. A mother tearfully recounted her son's unjust treatment during a routine traffic stop. A local business owner shared his frustration with police profiling in his predominantly black neighborhood. Each story added fuel to the fire, illustrating the widespread nature of the problem and the need for immediate action. Then, a man in uniform took the microphone. He was an officer, one of the few who had attended the event, and he spoke with conviction. "I became a cop because I wanted to protect people," he said, his voice tense but genuine. "But I know there are problems within our department. I see them every day. Officers like the one Judge Chambers encountered. They don't represent all of us, but they cast a shadow over all of us. We need to be better, and it's going to take courage to call it out." The crowd erupted in applause, and Elena felt a sense of hope bloom in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, there were people within the system who would stand with her. By the end of the town hall, it was clear that Elena's fight was no longer hers alone. People were ready to join her, to push for policy changes, to demand accountability, and to call for a thorough review of the police department's practices. As she left the event, a sense of empowerment replaced the fear she had felt before. She was not standing alone against an immovable system. She was now the center of a movement, one that was ready to confront the shadows that had long been ignored. That night, Elena returned home feeling exhausted yet exhilarated. Jason was waiting for her, watching the town hall coverage on television. He rose from the couch as she entered, pride radiating from his eyes. "You did it, Mom," he said, pulling her into a hug. "You're making a difference." Elena nodded, tears pricking her eyes. She was ready for whatever came next, knowing that she was no longer alone. The storm had risen, and she was prepared to weather it, knowing that this was only the beginning of her fight for justice. Breaking down walls. The morning after the town hall, Elena awoke to a flurry of phone notifications, messages, emails, and news alerts that hinted at the whirlwind her life had become. As she scrolled through the notifications, she realized just how much the event had resonated with people. Stories of the town hall had been picked up by national news outlets, and the hashtag Justice for All began trending online. Her words, and those of the community members who had shared their own experiences, had struck a chord. But not all the attention was positive. Alongside the messages of support were threads of anger and defensiveness from groups who felt that her actions were an attack on law enforcement as a whole. Some commenters accused her of undermining the police and fueling distrust. Others even questioned her integrity as a judge, hinting that her impartiality was compromised. It was a familiar tactic, shifting blame onto those who dared to speak out rather than addressing the issue at hand. But Elena reminded herself that she was prepared for this. Every word of doubt, every sliver of criticism only fueled her commitment further. As she sipped her coffee, she saw a message from Marcus, sent early that morning. "Elena, I've been getting calls from reporters and other civil rights groups. This is bigger than I thought it would be. People are ready for action, and I think it's time we push forward. We can't let this momentum slip away." Elena knew he was right. She responded quickly, agreeing to meet him later that day to discuss their next steps. In the meantime, she spent the morning going through the letters and emails she had received, each one adding another layer to the story she was building. She jotted down notes, collecting details and voices, determined to use every word as evidence that the problem was not isolated, it was systemic. When she arrived at Marcus's office, she was greeted by a sight she hadn't expected. The waiting room was packed with people, many of whom had come to offer their support or to ask for help. Some were local residents who had been at the town hall. Others were individuals who had read her story in the news and wanted to share their own encounters with law enforcement. Seeing their faces, the tired, hopeful, determined expressions, moved her. She realized that this wasn't just a fight for justice. It was a fight for dignity, for respect, and for the right to exist without fear of harassment or discrimination. Marcus met her at the door, his usual calm demeanor tinged with excitement. "Elena, come on in. You have to see this." He led her into his office, where several members of his team were gathered around a table piled high with files, notes, and laptops. Maps of the city were pinned to the walls, with certain neighborhoods marked in red, areas that, according to the data Marcus's team had been collecting, experienced higher than average rates of police stops and searches. "We've been going through the reports, complaints, and personal accounts that have come in over the past few days," Marcus said, pointing to one of the maps. "What we're seeing is a clear pattern. In certain neighborhoods, particularly communities of color, the rates of stops, searches, and arrests are disproportionately high, even though there's no evidence that these areas have higher crime rates. It's exactly what you've been talking about, profiling and bias, written into the fabric of policing." Elena stared at the maps, feeling the weight of the evidence settle over her. Seeing it laid out so clearly, so irrefutably, was both vindicating and heartbreaking. She had always known that the problem was widespread, but seeing it mapped out in stark detail made it impossible to ignore. "This is exactly what we need," she said, her voice filled with resolve. "This is the proof we've been looking for. We can't just bring my case to the internal affairs hearing. We need to bring all of this. The data, the stories, the patterns. They can't dismiss it as one isolated incident when we show them this." Marcus nodded, his face serious. "I agree. But we'll have to be careful. Once we go public with this, the backlash will be fierce. The police unions are already preparing to discredit you, and they'll come after everyone who stands with you. We need to be ready for that." Elena met his gaze, a steely determination in her eyes. "Let them try. I've spent my career defending the truth, and I'm not going to stop now. If they want to fight, they'll get one." They spent the rest of the afternoon strategizing, organizing the data into a cohesive narrative that would be impossible to ignore. Marcus's team helped prepare witness statements, reviewed each complaint for relevance, and outlined the arguments they would present at the hearing. By the time Elena left the office, it was dark outside, But she felt a new energy coursing through her. The walls of silence and complicity were beginning to crack, and she was determined to break them down entirely. Over the next few days, news of Elena's case continued to spread. Civil rights organizations from around the country reached out to offer their support, and several prominent attorneys and activists publicly voiced their solidarity with her cause. One evening, Elena received an unexpected call from Reverend Malcolm Price, a respected leader in the fight for social justice. He had organized some of the most impactful civil rights marches of the past decade and was a powerful advocate for reform. "Judge Chambers," he said, his voice deep and steady, "I've been watching your case, and I must say, your courage is inspiring. You're standing up for something that many people are afraid to face. If you're willing, I'd like to organize a rally in your support. I believe that when people stand together, the system is forced to listen." Elena felt a swell of gratitude and respect. "Thank you, Reverend Price. That means more than I can say. I would be honored to have your support." They spoke at length, planning the details of the rally and discussing how to ensure that the message remained focused on the need for systemic change. They wanted to avoid framing the issue as a simple case of bad cops versus good cops. Instead, they aimed to shed light on the policies, practices, and attitudes that enabled these abuses to continue unchecked. The rally was scheduled for the following Saturday, and as the day approached, excitement and tension built across the city. Flyers went up on storefronts, posters were shared on social media, and local activists mobilized to bring as many people as possible to the event. On the day of the rally, thousands of people gathered in the city square, filling the streets with signs, banners, and chants for justice. Elena stood on the stage, looking out over the crowd, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of support. People from all walks of life had come, young and old, families, students, professionals, activists. They were there to stand with her, to stand for justice, and to demand a future free from prejudice and fear. Reverend Price spoke first, his voice booming over the crowd as he reminded them of the power of unity, the importance of resilience, and the need for unwavering courage. "Today we are here not just to support Judge Chambers," he said, his voice filled with conviction, "but to fight for every person who has been marginalized, dismissed, or mistreated by the very system meant to protect them. This is not just her fight. It is our fight." The crowd erupted in applause, and Elena felt a surge of strength as she stepped forward to speak. She took a deep breath, allowing the weight of the moment to settle over her. "When I filed my complaint, I didn't expect this," she began, her voice carrying through the silence of the attentive crowd. "I expected pushback. I expected silence. What I didn't expect was you, all of you, standing here today. Your courage, your stories, and your voices are the fuel that drives this movement. This is not just about one incident or one officer. This is about changing a system that has too often failed to protect and respect all of its citizens equally." She paused, letting her words resonate with the crowd. "I believe in the power of justice, and I believe that together we can demand a system that truly serves us all. We will not be silent, we will not stand down, and we will not stop until justice is served." The crowd roared in response, their cheers echoing off the buildings, filling the air with a powerful sense of unity and purpose. As she stepped back from the microphone, Elena felt tears prick her eyes. She had never felt so connected to her community, so empowered by the strength of those around her. This wasn't just her battle anymore. It was a collective fight, one that would continue long after her case was resolved. After the rally, Elena and Marcus returned to his office, where they were greeted by even more support from civil rights groups, legal experts, and concerned citizens. People were ready to take this fight beyond the boundaries of one case to push for legislative changes and new policies that would prevent incidents like hers from happening again. But Elena knew that her fight wasn't over. The internal affairs hearing was still approaching, and she was prepared to present her case with every ounce of evidence they had gathered. She was ready to face the police department, the union representatives, and anyone who would try to downplay the reality of her experience. She was ready to break down the walls of silence and resistance, one brick at a time, until there was no place left for injustice to hide. As she sat in the quiet of her own home that night, reflecting on everything that had happened, Elena felt a profound sense of purpose. She had been a judge, a defender of justice within the system, but now she had become something more, a voice for the voiceless, a leader in the fight for true equality. And though the road ahead would be long and difficult, she was ready to walk it, surrounded by the strength and support of a community that believed in the same vision. The storm was still raging, but Elena no longer felt alone. The walls were coming down, and she would continue to fight until justice was no longer a distant hope, but a lived reality for everyone. You said, the fight for justice. The internal affairs hearing loomed closer, casting a heavy shadow over Elena's days. Yet despite the gravity of the event, her resolve only grew stronger. Each day brought new stories, more voices, more support, and at times, even more backlash. Her case had become a lightning rod for debates about policing, justice, and racial bias across the country. Some of the most respected journalists and analysts in the nation took on her story, dissecting it from every angle. But amid the media storm, Elena's focus never wavered. She knew what she had experienced, and she was prepared to make sure her story would not be buried. A few days before the hearing, Marcus called her with an update. Elena, I've just been informed that the police union has hired a high-profile defense attorney, Darren Blythe, to represent Officer McNair. They're preparing for an all-out battle. Elena frowned, recognizing the name. Blythe was known for his aggressive defense of police officers in high-stakes cases, often using tactics that aimed to undermine the credibility of those filing complaints. He was skilled at redirecting the narrative, making it seem as if the complainant's actions or background justified the officer's response. I figured they would come out swinging, she replied, her voice steady. But I'm not going to let him intimidate me. I know you won't, Marcus said, sounding both proud and concerned. But we should prepare for him to dig into every part of your life. He'll likely bring up your record, question your personal integrity, and try to paint you as someone who's exaggerating or playing a victim. Elena sighed, bracing herself for the fight. Let him try. I have nothing to hide, Marcus. And we have the facts on our side. They may try to twist the story, but people saw the footage, and they heard my account. They know the truth. They spent the next few days preparing meticulously. Marcus's team combed through every detail of the traffic stop, reviewing the dash cam footage frame by frame, documenting every inconsistency in McNair's actions. They gathered witness statements from residents in the area who had seen the stop, each statement reinforcing the irregularities in the officer's behavior. Marcus even managed to obtain past records of complaints against McNair, painting a broader picture of his pattern of conduct. The morning of the hearing arrived, and Elena awoke early, a mixture of determination and apprehension swirling inside her. She dressed carefully, donning her usual professional attire, but with a fierce sense of purpose. This wasn't just another day in court. This was her day to stand up not only for herself, but for the countless people who had been wronged by the system. Jason met her in the kitchen, his expression a mix of pride and worry. He had been her steadfast supporter throughout the ordeal, but she could see the concern etched in his face. Are you ready, Mom? He asked, his voice soft but steady. Elena nodded, giving him a reassuring smile. I am. I've never felt more ready for anything in my life. They drove to the Internal Affairs building together, the car filled with a tense silence as they both prepared for what lay ahead. As they approached the building, they saw a crowd of supporters gathered outside, holding signs, chanting, and showing their solidarity. Some held posters bearing phrases like, "Justice for all," and "Stand with Judge Chambers," while others displayed images of loved ones who had faced similar treatment at the hands of law enforcement. Elena felt a swell of gratitude and strength wash over her as she stepped out of the car, meeting the supportive gazes of those who had come to stand by her. Jason squeezed her hand, his own face brightening with pride at the show of solidarity. Inside the hearing room, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. A long wooden table separated Elena and Marcus from Officer McNair and his attorney, Darren Blythe, who was already setting up his materials with a smug, confident expression. The panel overseeing the hearing sat at the front, their faces unreadable as they prepared to review the evidence. Detective Harris, the lead investigator for internal affairs, opened the hearing with a brief statement, outlining the purpose of the proceedings and the importance of maintaining professionalism. His tone was neutral, but Elena sensed the underlying tension. This case was a potential powder keg, and everyone in the room knew it. Darren Blythe began with his opening statement, his voice smooth and polished. He painted Officer McNair as a diligent officer merely following protocol, suggesting that the stop had been justified based on what he called reasonable suspicion. Judge Chambers may be a respected figure in our community, Blythe said, his tone shifting as he glanced toward Elena. But that doesn't exempt her from the laws and protocols in place for everyone's safety. My client acted within the bounds of his authority, following standard procedures to ensure public safety. Elena felt her anger rise at the calculated phrasing, knowing that Blythe was trying to twist the narrative, to frame her as someone who believed herself above the law. But she maintained her composure, reminding herself that the truth would come out in her own statement. Marcus took his turn, presenting their case with precision and clarity. He laid out the facts, detailing McNair's approach, his failure to provide a valid reason for the stop, and his unwarranted search of her vehicle. He pointed to the dash cam footage, which had captured McNair's aggressive tone and unnecessary escalation, and he emphasized the racial bias evident in the pattern of stops conducted by McNair in similar neighborhoods. When it was finally Elena's turn to speak, she took a deep breath, allowing the weight of the moment to settle over her. She looked directly at the panel, her gaze steady and resolute. What you saw on that footage wasn't just a single incident. It was a reflection of a larger problem, one that permeates too many of our institutions, she began, her voice strong. I was stopped, not because of any violation, but because I fit a profile that is too often associated with suspicion and mistrust. Officer McNair didn't see me as a citizen. He saw me as a threat, and I want to make it clear. I am not here to undermine law enforcement. I am here to demand accountability, because without accountability, there is no justice. The room was silent, hanging on her words as she continued. I am speaking out not just for myself, but for everyone who has faced this kind of treatment without the resources or the voice to fight back. This isn't about one officer or one complaint. This is about a system that allows bias to go unchecked, that permits individuals to misuse their power without consequence. I am here to change that. As she sat down, a sense of calm washed over her, though she could feel the tension in the room had only intensified. Darren Blythe's smirk had disappeared, replaced by a tight-lipped expression as he prepared to cross-examine her. Judge Chambers, he began, his tone dripping with feigned politeness. While we all respect your position, isn't it true that you felt inconvenienced by the stop rather than genuinely mistreated? After all, as a judge, you're fully aware that police are required to be vigilant, are you not? Elena met his gaze evenly. I understand the need for vigilance, Mr. Blythe. But what I experienced was not vigilance. It was harassment. I am fully aware of what lawful policing looks like. This was not that. Blythe attempted to discredit her further, suggesting that her account was colored by her position of privilege as a judge, but Elena held her ground, refusing to let him twist her words. She was unflinching, responding to each question with clarity and conviction, refusing to be intimidated by his tactics. Finally, after hours of testimony, arguments, and rebuttals, the panel called a recess. The decision would not be immediate. They would review the evidence further and announce their findings within the week. But as Elena left the room, she felt a sense of accomplishment, knowing she had spoken her truth with courage. Outside, she was greeted by a wave of supporters, their cheers and encouragement echoing off the walls of the building. She smiled, feeling the surge of hope that justice might finally be within reach. She hugged Jason, who had waited patiently through the long proceedings, and together they walked through the crowd, thanking those who had stood by her. The days following the hearing were a whirlwind of anticipation and waiting. Elena continued to receive messages of support and offers of assistance from advocacy groups and community leaders. The case had sparked a nationwide conversation about racial profiling and police accountability, drawing the attention of policymakers who had long ignored these issues. Finally, on a cloudy Friday afternoon, Elena received the email she had been waiting for. The panel's decision would be announced that evening at a press conference, and she was invited to attend. Her heart pounded as she read the message, a mixture of nerves and hope filling her. She knew that whatever the outcome, she had taken a stand, but she hoped that her fight would bring about real change. That evening, Elena, Marcus, and Jason stood together in the crowd as the panel spokesperson stepped up to the podium. She held her breath, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The spokesperson cleared his throat, his expression serious as he began to read the decision. After a tense silence, he announced, "After a thorough review of the evidence, the panel has determined that Officer McNair's actions were not consistent with the standards of conduct expected of law enforcement personnel. We find sufficient grounds for disciplinary action, including suspension and mandatory bias training. Additionally, we are recommending a comprehensive review of departmental policies to address and prevent racial profiling and misconduct." The crowd erupted in cheers, and Elena felt a rush of relief and triumph. She had done it. She had stood up to the system and made them listen. She had not only won her case, but had sparked a movement, forcing the institution to confront its own flaws and take steps toward accountability. As she looked around at the smiling faces of her supporters, at Jason's proud expression, and at the strangers who had come to share in her victory, Elena knew that this was only the beginning. She had broken down walls, ignited a fire for justice, and inspired a community to stand up for what was right. Her journey wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever lay ahead. With renewed strength and determination, she embraced the path before her, knowing that her fight had become a catalyst for change, and that justice, true, lasting justice, was finally within reach. The dawn of change. The night of the panel's decision was one Elena would never forget. The crowd that had gathered outside the courthouse erupted in celebration. People hugged, cheered, and chanted her name, their voices echoing off the city's buildings. She stood among them, a wave of relief and gratitude washing over her. For the first time in what felt like forever, the weight that had pressed down on her since that fateful night with Officer McNair began to lift. But she knew this wasn't the end. It was merely the beginning of a new chapter. The following morning, Elena awoke to a series of news alerts. National headlines blared. Judge Chambers wins case, police department commits to reforms, and historic decision sparks calls for police accountability nationwide. The story had spread far beyond her city, igniting discussions in communities across the country. People were sharing their own encounters, calling for change, and using Elena's case as a rallying cry. As she scrolled through the headlines, her phone buzzed with a call from Marcus. "Elena," he said, his voice brimming with pride, "you've done something incredible." They'd reached out to my office from cities across the country, asking for guidance on how to pursue similar reforms. Your case has opened doors for people who thought they'd never have a chance at justice. Elena felt a swell of emotion as she listened to Marcus. "I'm overwhelmed, Marcus. I never imagined it would go this far. I just wanted justice, for myself, and for everyone who's been wronged by the system." "Justice is contagious," Marcus replied with a chuckle. "When people see what's possible, they start believing they can change things too. That's what you've done. You've given them hope." That day, Elena received calls from civil rights groups, lawmakers, and leaders from other cities who wanted to meet with her. She scheduled calls with several city officials, all of whom were interested in learning more about the reforms her city was now implementing. Inspired by the panel's recommendation for a departmental review, she and Marcus began drafting a set of guidelines aimed at preventing racial profiling and promoting accountability. But Elena wasn't only focused on policy. She knew that real change came from changing minds and hearts. She wanted to foster a dialogue between law enforcement and the communities they served, to bridge the deep divide that had been exposed. She reached out to Councilwoman Teresa Rhodes, proposing a series of community forums where residents could meet with officers and openly discuss their concerns. Teresa was immediately on board. "It's time for this city to heal, Elena," she said. "Your case brought a lot of wounds to the surface, and we need to address them. These forums could be a chance for people to speak their truth, to feel heard, and to start rebuilding trust." The first forum was scheduled 2 weeks later, held in a local high school gymnasium. The turnout exceeded all expectations. Hundreds of residents, young and old, packed the space, filling the bleachers and standing along the walls. Officers attended as well, many of whom had been following Elena's case closely. The tension was palpable, but so was a sense of possibility. For many, it was the first time they had ever been given a platform to speak openly about their experiences with law enforcement. Elena stood at the front, welcoming everyone with a warm but serious demeanor. "Tonight," she began, "we are here to listen. To each other, to our neighbors, and to those who have felt unseen or unheard. We are here to bridge the gap that has divided us for too long. This is not a time for blame. It's a time for honesty, for respect, and for building something better." The first person to speak was a young black man named Andrew. He stood, his posture tense, but his voice was steady as he shared his story. "I've been stopped 5 times this year alone, always for some minor thing that never seems to stick. I'm always told that I fit a description. But I'm not a suspect. I'm just trying to live my life." An officer across the room stood up, visibly affected. He introduced himself as Officer Jordan, a father of 3 who had grown up in the same neighborhood as Andrew. "I can't speak for every officer," he said, looking around the room, "but I can say that hearing your experience matters to me. I know the system isn't perfect, and I'm here because I want to understand. I want to do better." This exchange set the tone for the evening. One by one, residents shared their stories, some of fear, some of frustration, others of loss. Officers listened, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, but many nodding along, absorbing the impact of each account. And as the night went on, some of the officers shared their own experiences, about the pressures they faced, about the lack of training that left them unequipped to handle complex situations, about their struggles to balance duty with empathy. By the end of the night, something remarkable had happened. People were no longer speaking at each other. They were speaking with each other. Elena watched as strangers from opposite sides of the room began to approach each other, exchanging words of understanding, extending hands and gestures of goodwill. The forums became a monthly event, each one drawing even larger crowds and fostering deeper connections. Local journalists covered the meetings, and soon, other cities began replicating the model. The City Council, inspired by the progress, allocated funding to establish a permanent Community Accountability Council that would serve as an independent oversight body for the police department. The council would review cases of alleged misconduct, investigate complaints, and hold officers accountable, ensuring that cases like Elena's wouldn't slip through the cracks again. Months passed, and the reforms began to take shape. The police department instituted mandatory bias and de-escalation training for all officers, and a new policy required officers to provide clear explanations for stops and searches. Officers were encouraged to engage in community outreach, and programs were created to foster connections between law enforcement and youth in high-risk neighborhoods. The city even launched a scholarship fund in Elena's name, aimed at supporting young people from underrepresented backgrounds who wanted to pursue careers in law, criminal justice, and public policy. One afternoon, Elena received a call from Reverend Malcolm Price, who had organized the rally in her support. "Elena," he said, his voice warm and steady, I want you to see something. He invited her to a small, newly renovated community center on the edge of the city, a place that had once been neglected and forgotten. When Elena arrived, she was greeted by a group of local artists, activists, and community leaders who had gathered for the unveiling of a mural. Painted across the entire wall of the building was a stunning, vibrant image of Elena herself, standing tall, looking out over the city with determination in her eyes. Behind her were images of diverse faces, each one representing a life touched by her courage. The mural was titled "Justice Rising." Tears filled Elena's eyes as she looked at the mural, moved by the depth of the tribute. She had never sought recognition, but seeing her likeness alongside the faces of her community felt like an affirmation that the fight had been worth it. She had stood against a system that many believed to be unbreakable, and in doing so, she had inspired others to believe in their own power. As she stood there, surrounded by friends, family, and supporters, Elena's phone buzzed with a message. It was from Jason, who was in his final semester at college. "Mom," he wrote, "I'm proud of you. You've changed the world." She smiled, feeling a surge of pride for her son, who had stood by her side through every step of her journey. She knew that his future, and the future of others like him, would be a little brighter, a little safer, because of what they had accomplished. In the months that followed, Elena continued to advocate for justice, expanding her work beyond the city. She was invited to speak at conferences, to testify before legislative committees, and to collaborate with other cities on similar reforms. Each time she spoke, she reminded her audience that change wasn't a single moment, but a continuous journey, one that required courage, resilience, and the willingness to stand up even when it felt impossible. Years later, Elena would look back on that fateful traffic stop as the catalyst that had transformed her life. What had begun as an encounter filled with indignity and fear had become a powerful movement for justice, one that had reshaped her city and sparked reforms across the nation. She had proven that even one voice, when fueled by truth and determination, could shake the foundations of an entire system. And as she walked through her city, past murals bearing her likeness, past schools named in honor of those who had joined her fight, Elena felt a deep, abiding peace. She had left a legacy of justice, a testament to the strength of those who refused to be silenced, and a promise that the fight would continue until true equality was not just a dream, but a reality for all. In the end, she had not only fought for justice, she had embodied it, inspiring generations to come. The dawn of change was here, and Elena knew that it would light the way forward long after her journey had begun.